Our first speaker is Professor Catherine Pakaluk. It's my pleasure to introduce her. Catherine Ruth Pakaluk received her PhD degree in 2010. She recently joined the faculty at the Bush School in the summer of 2016 and is the founder of the social research academic area, where she is professor and chair of the economics department at Ave Maria University. Her primary areas of interest include economics of education and religion, family studies and demography, Catholic social thought, and political economy. Dr. Pakaluk is the 2015 anybody who wasn't his friend for forever. This is a prize given for significant contributions to the study of the relationship between religion and economic liberty. Catherine did her doctoral work at Harvard University under Carolyn Hawksby, David Cutler, and 2016 Nobel laureate Oliver Hart. Her dissertation, entitled Essays in Applied Microeconomics, examined the relationship between religious fit and educational outcomes, the role of parental effort in observed peer effects and school quality, and theoretical aspects of the contraceptive revolution as regards 20th century demographic trends. She received a master's degree in economics from Harvard and a bachelor's degree from the University of Pennsylvania in mathematics and economics. Beyond her formal training in economics, Dr. Pakaluk studied Catholic social thought under the mentorship of F. Russell Hittinger and various aspects of Thomistic thought with Stephen A. Long. She is a widely admired writer and sought-after speaker on matters of culture, gender, social science, the vocation of women, and the work of Edith Stein. She lives in Maryland with her husband, Michael Pakaluk, and their 8 children. Spencer, does she need to use this? If you'll come in.
Stick this one in my
In that
yeah.
coats.
Right.
This can go in your pocket if you need to move.
Okay.
Or just
All right.
if you don't.
Great. Okay. Great. Can you hear me well? No. Trying again. No, still not working. That works. Okay. So this works, but not this one. Maybe I'll just hold this. Okay. Yeah, no. I have to get it. Let's see. It goes higher. Yeah. Great. Does this work? Can you hear me well? Okay. Excellent. Great. Thank you for this gracious introduction, Richard. It's a wonderful pleasure to be here in the shadow of these beautiful mountains. I've been here twice before, and both times I remember I was here with a child, either with a small baby once in tow, and maybe almost 10 years ago, and then 8 years ago with I was expecting my 7th. And so I'm a little sad to be here without a baby, actually. And last night was lovely to hear the sounds of children in the room. It would be difficult, I think, for me this morning to overstate the affection that I have for our hosts here, the scholars and the administrators of the Wheatley Institution, and for my friends and colleagues at Brigham Young. There are few people, I think, who do have the courage to put first things first and to ask the big questions, and even fewer who do these things out of love for God and country. But our hosts are just these sort of people, and so my joy at being here is especially real. So I've been asked to open this morning on marriage, and this is something I do with a lot of joy because, as I've noted in my title, I think there is hardly anything save religion, which contributes more extensively to the measure of national greatness. So I'm going to talk a little bit about this. Forgive me. So greatness, I think, is the measure of a people. You and we were not made for comfort but for glory, to be servants of love, as St. Teresa of Avila writes. Heroes and heroines of a life well lived. And heroism is, after all, the subject of every life well lived. And you, dear students, have yet to live well. My hope is that these remarks may double as an exhortation, as well as some hopefully insightful social commentary. Your choices are still in front of you, and the next years of your lives will determine whether you are on the path to heroism or on the path to something else. Worse still, and this is true, you are about to enter a kind of perilous time of life from the perspective of living well. And since living well is the point of life, we might say you are just about to enter the most perilous time of your life, period. This peril is not because college is often a time of loose living, this is true, and not because many colleges fail to provide a great education, which is also true. Nor is it finally because college is a place where many fall away from God in spite of their best intentions. True as these things are, they don't constitute what I think is the greatest danger. What is most perilous is the time in your life where you will live as an adult, but without being institutionally, so we're going to talk about institutions this morning, institutionally and bindingly committed to live for another person. According in this institutional and binding commitment, according to rules and norms that you don't get to make up. This perilous time I'm describing, this is your time as a single adult. And in this time you live untethered to the institutions that exist to turn your heroic aspirations into the heroic deeds that form the substance of a good life. Okay, so what do I mean by this? In this time as a single adult, you are, in a sense, would-be heroes without a field of battle, without weapons for a fight, and without a hill to take. In 1965, the fathers of the Catholic Church proclaimed that man is the only creature on earth which God willed for itself, who can't find himself except through a sincere gift of himself. The secret of living well, what the Christian tradition has always called heroic virtue, and this heroism theme is something we neglect today, I think, very often, but heroic virtue is the substance of the living well in the Christian tradition. So this is not to live, I think, for the whole world, right? Or not even for others in a vague sense, but actually for some particular others. Because others in a vague sense don't make demands on us very much. And they rarely require our sacrifices. We can't live for everyone if we don't live for someone. And this is precisely what is at stake when we consider the phenomenon that sociologists call the retreat from marriage. And what I am going to call today marriagelessness. So I'm going to bring you a new word, marriagelessness. So what is at stake is the loss of souls who become other regarding as a matter of habit. And this habit, or this virtue, is the medium and long range, I didn't say short term, medium and long range outcome of a kind of adventure, an exacting training, right? A voluntary task taken on by young people who willingly tie or tether themselves to the proverbial mast in pursuit of their Penelope. This is heroism of no small proportion. In contrast, the marriageless society views the untethered, self-regarding adult as the triumphalist end of a reductionist, and if you ask me, unromantic, school system that cultivates skills rather than proper loves, and reduces even what we call love to a self-regarding competency, a kind of skill. In short, a marriageless society is one in which there are no heroes, but only autocrats. Every man, woman, and child engaged in a struggle to find meaning and identity within himself or herself and for himself. and to weigh relational activity, our activity with others, familial, political, economic, in these terms. I have hesitated, although you may be thinking about it, to use the term individualism up until now, because it's important for my argument this morning to get the causality right, the direction of the causality. The claim I want to make about institutions is exactly this one, that we have not been bad at institutions because we have become more individualistic. Rather, that we've become more individualistic because we've been bad at institutions. And I'll explain in a moment. Thinking about institutions is not an unusual move for economists, but I'll explain that a bit more later. I want to say this morning that we have not even understood institutions. And this failure, even among religious and conservative persons, cripples our ability to understand the rapidly changing social landscape. It also cripples our ability to improve things. It's not enough, I think, and maybe not even right, to preach marriage in a marriageless society. It is probably more important to preach the paradox of the seed falling to the ground to bear fruit, the paradox of giving ourselves away to find ourselves. Because sound institutions, good institutions, ask this of us. It's the paradox of freedom within voluntary imprisonment. Voluntary. To do this, preaching the paradox of the seed falling to the ground, we must be willing to be a philosophical people. We must be willing to explore the depths of human nature and to understand what it means to be dependent creatures. What it means to say, and this is true, that there is no stability in me. What it means to say that I am powerless to achieve my great aspirations for nobility and heroism. But that a good God has not left me without a path to victory. So in short, we must begin with something like obedience to the truth about God and man, the first condition of freedom, and the wellspring of the full identity of man. So in the time that remains, it's my introduction, in the time that remains, I want to do three things. So the first thing I want to do is unpack a little bit more of what I mean when I say marriagelessness. So it's a word I invented. So marriagelessness as I'm using it today, to try to get a sense of its full weight. The second thing I want to do is try to connect marriagelessness and also another related word, childlessness, you know the word childlessness, to something like the primal political and cultural realities. And third, and this is, I promise, all less than an hour, I will make an argument about institutions and heroism in order to help trace out or think about the mechanism, like how do we go from marriagelessness to this sort of threat to national greatness, to the loss of heroism. So first, on marriagelessness, I've given you a precursor. This is the only number I'm going to give you. Not quite, but I was chuckling last night. Ryan Anderson gave us lots and lots of numbers, and he thought that I might give you more numbers. But in fact, I'm not that interested in numbers. So I am. I have my moments, but I think that non-social scientists think social scientists are really into numbers, and I think there's something sort of wrong about that, actually. So we switched hats, I think, between me and Ryan today. So marriagelessness. I think that contemporary debates about same-sex marriage and all of the preceding debates up to that debate about same-sex marriage, the ones about no-fault divorce, for instance, they do very little, I think, to help us feel viscerally, like intuitively, the reality of the change that's taken place in relation to marriage. So it's sometimes when you're in a social reality, it's very difficult to step outside and see what changed. So I'm going to try to do that, try to communicate a bigger change than even what this number shows you. So we appreciate with these debates that we're fighting over important things that matter, but we don't have any real intuitive sense of what we've lost or what life looked like when marriage was lived more as an institution than it is now. I don't subscribe to the idea that everything was always better in the past, but this at least was different. So a good place to start when we think about marriagelessness is this Pew Research Center finding, which I have up here, that half of U.S. adults are married today. Okay, half of U.S. adults are married today. So this number that I think you can see the fine print there. This is based on ACS IPUMS data, looking over several decades. So Pew estimates that approximately, if you take a cross-section of American adults, everybody 18 and older, that roughly 50%. In the last couple of years, this has finally gotten just, and I expect another year it will dip below 50%, and there'll be lots of news stories about it for 5 minutes. We'll think about it. Now, this is a really low number. It's a really, really low number. So as far back as I can get, the number is really this number. So in 1960, this number was 72%. 72% is a lot bigger, and that's a very big shift. So so you might wonder why this number, this is the percentage, just the cross-section of married adults. Getting marriage rates, right, the rate of marriage and also divorce rates, it's a very difficult thing to do. It's notoriously difficult for demographers and economists. The denominator is a tough thing to figure out for a marriage rate. Are you thinking about all the people? Are you thinking about all the single people, the never married people, the previously married people? So difficult to do. And then the percentage of adults, this number, just the sheer percentage of adults who are married. I like this number. It gives us a sense of the weight. Like we look around outside and we think, what's the weight of the married people? Now, note that this 50%, because it's a very sort of simple number, it includes all the people who maybe were divorced and then remarried, so just who's presently married. So it's not necessarily a measure of the strength of traditional marriage, right? So this it could be weaker than 50%. But it is a good measure of this. I think it's an opening measure of what I'm calling marriagelessness. It's the percentage of adults who are legally untethered to another adult in day-to-day life. So this is a massive, massive shift over a half century. And I think a lot is to be made of this if we think that habits matter a lot. I did try to find something like a tracking of the marriage rates from some of the people who try to put these things together. They're not easy to obtain. I have this for you. For those who do attempt to make historical tabulations of marriage rates, they would conclude that we are today at lower marriage rates even than those that marked the Great Depression. I don't have a pointer, but you can see these, they're labeled there. Very low rates. The denominator here is just all the people, so this is marriages divided by the number, per 1,000 people. And the orange line there is divorce rates. So in the Great Depression, we had a big dip, and then, the sort of post-World War II boom in marriages, so there's it's just a moving thing. It's moving a lot. But today you can see that's really trending downward. You can see that divorces were trending upward for a while, but we do understand that the divorce rate per se is moving downward as well. But this is a function of, reduced marriage overall. So it's very difficult to understand these trends simpliciter, but it at least gives you kind of a picture. When we say today that we believe we have lower marriage rates than we have historically in the time that we can see it, this appears to be correct. Yeah. Okay, so the Pew Research Center further states that the United States is not singular in this, so we're not sort of a special country. They say that the United States is by no means the only nation where marriage has been losing market share for the past half century. The same trend has taken hold in most other advanced post-industrial societies, and these long-term declines appear to be largely unrelated to the business cycle, so this is important. This is not sort of, when things are good, people get married, and when things are bad, they hunker down and don't get married. Declines, the Pew Research Center says, have persisted through good and bad economic times. Okay, so comparable statistics to these are impossible to obtain for early American history. I'm very interested in tracking these sort of social changes and the things we think about in even 100 years ago. So I can't give you what this looks like for the 1600s, but it might be interesting to consider this piece of data from Andrew Cherlin's book on marriage, The Marriage Go-Round. He said, so essential was marriage-based family life that the New England colonies in the 1600s passed laws forbidding people to live alone. And of course, these were really basically aimed at men. Right? So in the 1600s, the idea that a single man would move into your village and sort of set up a household was just completely unthinkable. And so unthinkable that they said, it's not allowed. It's essentially, this is sort of creepy. Single men are not really to be trusted. They're not stable. We don't want them around, and they might be predatory. So imagine, great, so now put that fact in your mind and then think about 50% of U.S. adults are untethered. I mean, that's a massive shift in the way we think about what it means to be an adult or what it means to be a good adult. So the Connecticut law of 1636, no man that is neither married nor hath any servant nor is a public officer shall keep house of himself without consent of the town where he lives. Like, they have to go get permission. Maybe if you're old enough and gentle enough. But men should not be living alone. All right, so it's very interesting. So contrast such an attitude in which single men are considered a blight with the contemporary social script in which marriage is sort of the end point. I think that Ryan Anderson mentioned this last night. Marriage is now instead sort of the end point of a long contemporary social script. Journeys of experiences oriented to self-discovery, right? You're supposed to go to college, do a bunch of things, get a career, travel the world. It's a climatic capstone event after a sequence of school, higher education, job, career, travel, maybe even home ownership. Marriage is certainly not the beginning of adult life, right? It's a kind of a capstone event. And now, in case you think I'm picking on the men and the single men, and I could give you several of these sort of several interesting data points about men and their, but women. I'm going to pick on the women for a minute. So, so I have something from Kay Himowitz, who's a really interesting social thinker. She says she talks about the rise of single young female lifestyle. So she says, today's aspiring middle-class women are gearing up to be part of the paid labor market for most of their adult lives. Unlike their ancestral singles, they're looking for careers, not jobs. That means they're going to need lots of schooling. And so she talks about the good jobs going to those with degrees. So we know this trend that women are particularly enrolling in colleges and universities at unprecedented rates. Between 1960 and 2000, the percentages of 20, 25, and 30-year-olds enrolled in school more than doubled in the US, and enrollment in higher education doubled throughout Europe. And the fairer sex makes up an increasing part of this total. And she goes on and she says that educated women are staying single is unsurprising. Degreed women have always been more likely to marry late, if they marry at all. But what has demographers taking notice is the sheer transnational numbers, right? So think about this as I read through this. This is compelling in and of itself. Think about the marriagelessness that I was talking about. I'm trying to describe and give you a sense of the weight of this. The sheer transnational numbers of women postponing marriage while they get diplomas and start careers. In the UK, close to a third of 30-year-old college-educated women are unmarried. A third. Some demographers predict that 30% of women with university degrees will remain forever childless. In Spain, not so long ago, a culturally Catholic country where a girl's family would jealously chaperone her until handing her over to a husband at 21. I should say that my grown daughters did all live with me until they got married, and they were all married around 21. So now, instead, women constitute 54% of college students, and the average age of first birth has risen to nearly 30. The average age of first birth, which appears to be a world record, she says. Combine these trends, delayed marriage, expanded higher education, labor force participation, next quote, with urbanization, and add global media and some disposable income, and voila, an international lifestyle is born. One of its defining characteristics is long hours of work, often in quasi-creative fields like media, fashion, communication. She's picking on the women here. The lifestyle also means new realms of leisure and consumption, often enjoyed with groups of close girlfriends, trendy cafes. This is a different lifestyle, right, than a marriageful society, right? This isn't accidental singleness. This isn't. This is the deliberate cultivation of a mode of single, self-regarding living with attendant habits and social industries. Swedish, coffee concoctions, cocktails, trips and vacations with your single friends. So I want to say, to return to this question of individualism and marriagelessness, if something like rugged individualism has always characterized the American temperament, a kind of go west frontier mentality, as Andrew Cherlin puts it, that temperamental individualism was a feature of the household in the past, the household, and not of the individual man or woman. The household was understood to be, in this frontier mentality, sufficient, or mostly so, from the community, and certainly sufficient from the state. That's the kind of individualism we think of as a kind of historical American individualism. And that may have been exaggerated, it may have been not completely right. But that kind of individualism did not suppose that the man or woman was sufficient from the family. So legally, households were united in the legal person of the husband under the doctrine of coverture, The two are kind of one flesh, right? So the individualism which might have been faulted in the American project was a familyism of a certain kind, or a householdism, not an actual individualism. So Churlin says, for instance, that within the family itself, there was little individualism. The husband and wife, I like this image, the husband and wife were engaged in a joint enterprise, struggling to subsist in the New England climate. I like this. That would be me. I'd be struggling to subsist. This is too cold for me. Instead, the individualism constituted by marriagelessness, the thing I'm defining for you now, move forward here, by this increase in single self-regarding lifestyle. It's described by Churlin as expressive individualism, so it's a different kind of individualism. So he says that the shift from role-playing in traditional marriage to the new self-focus was part of a broader increase in expressive individualism in American culture, the kind of individualism that involves growing and changing as a person, paying attention to your own feelings and expressing your needs. Expressive individualism encourages people to look inward to see how they are doing, and it encourages them to want personal growth throughout adulthood. It's not incompatible with lifelong marriage, but it requires a new kind of marriage in which the spouses are free to grow and change and in which each feels personally fulfilled. Such marriages are harder to keep together because what matters is not merely the things that they jointly produce, this joint enterprise of subsistence against the outside world, and even, for instance, well-adjusted children. Ooh, I don't know if I touched something. But also each person's own happiness, right? And a kind of daily measure of each person's own happiness. So Churlin says, well, these marriages are harder to keep together, yes, but they're harder to form, too. Now, heading into the 80s and the 90s, Churlin tells us that more than half of first marriages began as cohabiting relationships. Although the percentage of young adults, he says, who were married dropped sharply, the percentage who were in a partnership of some kind, cohabiting or marital, dropped much less. Cohabiting had become a complex phenomenon. It included childless adults, others who were testing a relationship, and others who had a child together. So all kinds of mixed up persons trying out living together. And he goes on to say that the phenomenon of multiple increased partnerships increased sharply after the 1950s. The great growth of cohabiting partnerships and the doubling of the divorce rate since then can't be tied to an increase in restlessness because there wasn't one. By the way, restlessness is what he calls this sort of frontier individualism. Rather, these trends reflect the spread of an individualistic view of family life that emphasizes personal growth. What we're experiencing is the rise of a newer, self-development-oriented kind of individualism, whereas restlessness or frontier individualism was about the older, self-reliant move west. So taken together, the key feature, I want to say, of the marriagelessness that I'm thinking about is that a substantial proportion of adults define and experience well-being outside of reference to gifts of time, attachment, sacrifice, and legal ties to others. I use the language of self-regarding. Churlin uses the language of personal growth. Marriagelessness is the state of being legally self-regarding. And cohabitors may be practically bound to one another for the sake of the conveniences and pleasantries of daily life. If you live with someone and you sort of are completely self-regarding, you're not going to have a great time of it. But no one will hold them accountable when they suppose that personal growth has compelled them onward to seek a new and different intimate partnership. Of course, even married spouses today, we know, and I'm not a legal scholar, but we know that married spouses today are not really legally bound in the way that they were in the past. And this is another way of seeing what I'm calling marriagelessness, right? That marriage is less what it is. Even marriage itself in our regime resembles what is not marriage, right? And less what it is. So marriage is less what it is because the essentially other regarding institution of marriage was transformed by a kind of relentless pursuit of childlessness. And childlessness is the other side of the coin of marriagelessness. So I want to say it's another way of thinking about what marriagelessness is. So we could even go a step further and say that since marriage just is that institution, the only institution ordered exclusively to the procreation and education of children, we can take the measures of childlessness as another way to measure marriagelessness. They are actually the same social statistic, right? So if you're floundering on trying to get a read on how much less marriage we have or how much marriagelessness we have, I'm suggesting that a good way to figure it out or to fill out the picture is actually to do what Ryan Anderson did last night, so I don't need to do it for you, is actually to walk through the data on what's going on with children, right? So we can begin, and I'm not going to go all as far as Ryan did, but we can begin by considering that the United States is in the midst, and now I'm quoting from the recent data on fertility rates, the United States is in the midst of historic collapse in childbearing. So 10 years ago, the typical American woman had about 2 children, 2.1. Today, it's about 1.7, representing a collapse in fertility on par with the declines in other countries, such as Japan or Canada. We tend to think of ourselves as kind of unique. We have for a long time. We are not. The CDC reported last month and I think I have this data for you. There you go. The CDC reported last month in January of 2019, lowest ever fertility rates for American women in every American state. There are no more exceptions. So although some states, notably this state is about among the highest in the nation, we're really not looking at substantial fertility rates. So the purple states you can see there, North Dakota, South Dakota, Nebraska, Idaho, Utah, are much closer to the 2.1, but we're not looking that strong. The national rate is 1.7. Sociologists, as you know, and I quoted for you earlier, use this term, I don't know if you've heard it before, retreat from marriage, to describe the cluster of patterns that I'm referring to as marriagelessness. Increasing age at first marriage, increasing divorce rates, lower percentages of adults who are married. But let us think about another phrase, retreat from children. When we think about the various phenomena that have been coincident, occurring at the same time, as the falling total fertility rates since the 1960s. So what are all of these trends, these retreat from children trends? And in other words, how are children doing? And again, this is where I think Dr. Anderson's list of things was quite helpful. Think about abortion rates. Think about the percentage of children who are raised without both biological parents. Think about, for instance, the hypersexualization of children and increased levels of sex trafficking. Think about the staggering numbers of children sitting around in foster care in this country. Think about, one of my favorite topics, the complete and utter stagnation of national educational achievement, a school system which has entirely failed to put children's needs first. So we can call this childlessness, right? So you see what I'm doing here. I'm describing a kind of regime, a kind of set of norms, not the lack of a child of an individual couple, but a kind of orientation of society, which is not towards children. So each of these measures of childlessness, I want to say, is a measure of marriagelessness. Or whose job is it, ultimately, to look out for the kids? Or how can it be, as my 10-year-old just asked me last week at church, he said, Mom, like in the middle of church, how do you get a baby if you're not married? Look at like, hey buddy, can we talk about this later? But what is evident to a 10-year-old, right, that marriage is where children come. That's evident to my 10-year-old, is good enough for me. It's the solemn obligation, right, the duty of married persons. It's their authority to receive and care for children. So as children fare, so marriage cries out for judgment. The fate of children convicts marriage, right? So I don't really care if you get me a 72% up there. Let's go back to 1960. We have a 72% of married persons. It may not be a particularly marriage-full society, right? So if children are not doing well, this is what I want to say. We're at 50% across the board. I still think that's staggeringly low, but it's a lot worse than that 50% number. We're not a marriage people because we failed to be a people which values children above all else, especially above our own good, our own comfort, and our own personal growth. Okay. So I want to talk now about marriagelessness and the consequences of it, or kind of how consequential is it? So how consequential is marriagelessness? I'm going to do a little bit more theory here. So the answer, quite possibly, is that it is more consequential than anything else. And I'm going to present you some data which I think is really interesting, but also is mysterious. I'm not sure that we understand fully how we get from marriagelessness to what I'm going to show you in a minute. This is what I'm going to show you in a minute. But this is what I want to try to unpack when I get to some remarks about institutions at the end. So how consequential is marriagelessness? The answer quite possibly is that it is more consequential than anything else. So the demographers, a group of demographers have been working on this particular theme of thought for a couple of decades. Their work is really interesting. So we have Ron, mostly what I'm quoting for you today is work of Ron Listaga, but also his colleagues Dick Van de Ka and Leonard Sirkin, and then Lisa Niedert in his more recent work. They have pointed out that the cluster of demographic behaviors emerging since the 1960s, those same ones that I have been calling marriagelessness, they have a different name for it. These would include delayed marriage, cohabitation, delayed childbearing, divorce, and low lifetime fertility. It's so pronounced, they say, so unique in the history of demographic trends that they want to say that this thing that happened in 1960 constitutes a distinct phase in the overall development of the demographics of the West. So they use the term the second demographic transition to distinguish it from the first, which they would pinpoint around 1800. So they say the distinctness, this is this quote, the distinctness of the second demographic transition stems directly from Philippe Ariès' analysis of the history of childhood. This is a really fascinating work. And as Dick Van de Ka and I have repeatedly pointed out, on the two successive and distinct motivations for parenthood, during the first demographic transition, the decline in fertility, right, from 1800, in the United States, we had about a 7 total lifetime total fertility for women was about 7, right? So during the first demographic transition, the decline in fertility was unleashed by an enormous sentimental and financial investment in the child. This is child-oriented decline in fertility, they want to say. Whereas the motivation during the second demographic transition is adult self-realization within the role or the lifestyle as a parent or more complete and fulfilled adult, right? This is social science coming from a very different place from Andrew Cherlin, and they've happened on the same kind of phenomenon. So in an earlier work than the one I've just quoted, these same scholars examined trends in second transition behaviors, or I would say marriagelessness behaviors, by state and county in the United States. And they thought to look at the correlation with voting patterns in the United States. Remember, I'm asking the question, how consequential is marriagelessness? So that we can do this thing, which is we can take all of these marriagelessness behaviors, these second transition behaviors, and we can map them out. This is by county in the United States. The more orange counties are they have a negative index on the, so their standard deviation from the mean of the county is less marriagelessness. Can we do the double negative? So they're less along this path of transition to a kind of marriageless society. So, and that should be apparent to you from the map, right? So the more orange states, like Utah, for instance, and parts of Texas, Nebraska, Arkansas, for instance, all of those counties are less along this path, less far along this path. And the more blue you are, the more far along this path you are. So you have a positive deviation from the mean of your county. So they actually went ahead and the best I can do for you is to just give you the overlay of the two maps. So here instead is the map by county of the 2004 elections. And so you may have heard about this on some level at the time of the elections. Of course, you guys, many of you were very small children in 2004, but it was somewhat commented upon, but some of the numbers hadn't been looked at. This is the map of, so I can kind of go back and forth quickly. It's not, I mean, the colors don't match up perfectly, but they said what they found here was nothing short of, I think, remarkable. They think it's pretty remarkable too. Something like the spatial correlation, so looking at the counties correlating, and this is raw correlations, the correlation spatially between voting for Bush and the second transition behaviors varied between a negative 0.7 and a 0.9, depending on the factor. This is a very large correlation factor. And this is to say these are negative correlations. So we're going to do the double negative again, that districts with less traditional family behaviors or more advanced second transition behaviors were less likely to vote for Bush or the Republican or conservative candidate. And this relationship was statistically very high, okay, very, very high. So the authors stated, and in this first work, they said the very strong negative correlation found here between the second demographic transition dimension and the percentage votes for Bush is, to our knowledge, one of the highest spatial correlations between demographic and voting behavior on record. So they were stunned by this. So I just, what you're supposed to see here, if I had better habits, is that you can overlay these two maps on top of each other and see a very strong similarity. So why is this true? So this is very interesting. So now a keen observer might ask if these associations that we're looking at between these counties and their voting patterns and their family behavior, are these just spurious correlations, right? Are we just looking at spurious connections, little causal weight? So on this, the authors make a number of tests. And these are demographers. They do things a little bit differently from how economists would do them, but this is fairly robust. So what they do is they introduce a variety of control variables to try to reduce the correlation, right? When a good social scientist, you think you found an effect or a cause, you should just try to make it go away. You introduce a whole bunch of new control variables and see if you can make it disappear. And they actually say this. They say, what we're going to try to do here is try to make this number go away. So they report, and I have this for you on another slide, the outcome of these tests, their efforts to make this variation go away, is that the correlation between the demographic variables and the voting for Bush cannot be considered as spurious or as the mere outcome of the operation of a common causal determinant, at least not among the things they can measure, and they grab a lot of things. The control variables simply failed to reduce the correlation coefficients to a significant extent to warrant such a conclusion. And since the demographic picture was unfolding well before the 2000 and 2004 elections, in other words, what precedes the other in time, right? Well, the family structure variables precede the voting. They say this leaves us with no alternative other than temporarily, at least, until we find some other explanation, accepting the hypothesis that the spatial pattern of the second demographic transition in the U.S. was a non-redundant co-determinant of the red, purple, and blue voting patterns at the level of states. And they confirm this as well with the same kind of tests at the level of the counties. This is really kind of stunning. They're kind of stunned by this. I think it's kind of cool, right? If you're a social scientist, you find correlations like that and they seem to be real. You're like, wow, that's great. That's like a textbook thing. You know, you don't get correlations like one, except in textbooks. Okay, so the evidence suggests that the further a state or county had retreated from traditional patterns of family formation in 2000 and 2004. That is, the more divorce, the more cohabitation, the fewer children, the more marriagelessness and childlessness, the more likely it was to vote for a politically liberal candidate. Now, they've recently updated this work, so in case you're sitting there thinking what they thought, well, couldn't it be that in 2000 and 2004, well, those were sort of singular elections in which family and marriage issues were very important in the political debate. So they actually went forward, and looking at time here, I think I'm gonna, in the interest of time, I'm gonna skip some of these slides, but I'll sum up for you. They went forward and looked all the way back to 1968, and they said, well, is it possible that these were just sort of family elections? What about the economic elections like 2008? And what about backwards to 1996? And they found, let's see if I can find the right conclusion. Let's see here. A lot of examples for you. The same findings. So I'm going to summarize, but basically they keep finding, gosh, this is really consistent as far back as we can go. And they find that essentially, just like all that other stuff, something changed in the 1960s, and the associations between the sort of the family structure variables and the voting patterns are kind of weak back in the 70s and the 80s. And then by the mid-1990s, 1996 seems to be the turning point for them. At the onset of 1996, a control for religious composition, this is in their robustness tests, does reduce the raw correlation by a noticeable degree, but by 2000, this is not the case. For the latest election, none of the controls have any significant effect. And the original correlation, it's almost 0.9, it's 0.9 for the Trump elections, basically. The original correlation proves to be very robust indeed. Stated differently, at the level of the states, the negative zero correlation or raw correlation between the STT dimension and the Republican vote cannot be considered spurious. They actually want to argue, by the way, in the context of this paper, they want to argue we should be cautious in considering the Trump election as some kind of conservative backlash. They say, we think this was all just kind of mapped out based on how people are living their family lives. They don't want us to read it as, a foment of, racism or anti-immigration or other kinds of weird conservative trends. Or they say, caution, wait, this just looks to be continuing what we've seen since 2000. So what conclusions may be drawn for this, I would say, are not entirely clear. Lestaga and his co-authors point out that we should not, as I said, consider voting for Trump as a wholesale conservative backlash. At first pass, I don't know what you think when you look at this material. We might say that it crystallizes the idea that the family is the basic cell of society. On both the left and the right, we do tend to believe, I think, that our political ideals arise from pure first principles. I don't dispute this, but it's worth asking how it is that we come to find certain first principles more compelling than others. Why is it that we also believe that, or we feel that some public debates never seem to reach resolution through reasoned dialogue? So is the family perhaps, and the habits of life pertaining to our practice of it, remember I was going to focus on virtue and habits, maybe the source of those, as Pascal said, those reasons of the heart, that of which reason knows nothing. So here I want to do something now to wrap up, to talk about institutions a little bit. You may or may not know that the 1993 Nobel laureate Douglas North spent a lot of his career as an economist talking about the structure of institutions. And so this is not a strange move for an economist, although what I'm going to do today is going to sound very different from anything Douglas North would have told you. But the connections here are, I think, kind of interesting. And in fact, up until now, economists have done very little to think about the institutional forms of families and how those play out in social life, but I think there's a lot there to be investigated. So when Cherlin described the rise of marriage based on expressive individualism, he contrasted, and I'm going to give you this quote in advance, he contrasted this form with an earlier practice of marriage that he called traditional or institutional. Institutional marriage is marked by the shared commitment of spouses, usually implicitly and not explicitly, based on social norms, right? The commitment to take on roles or parts in the joint acquisition of the common goods of a marriage. Now, a common good is whatever good cannot be achieved without the others. The unique common good of marriage is children. The joint offspring of a marriage are the only good which is fully exclusive to that couple. Children require at least their own two parents, but they also require only their own two parents in the primary domestic association. Traditional rules and norms of institutional marriage are oriented to this good, to the good of children. Husband and wife agreed to live, and this is important, for each other, but for the sake of future others who need the two as one. Coincidentally, the bond formed for the sake of future others is itself a common good. They live for each other, and this is good, but this is not and cannot be an ordering principle of marriage, since the living for each other doesn't provide a reason for the forms of marriage most favorable to children. So as Cherlin put it, no one seemed to consider the possibility, and this is this quote, that once emotional satisfaction became a central focus, the living for each other, the romanticism, it might be difficult to limit it to marriage. No one foresaw that Americans might seek love and companionship with live-in partners, that large numbers would think it justifiable if they were unhappy in their intimate lives to obtain a divorce and move on. So simply put, the living for each other as a romantic proposition cannot sustain the family association that children most need. But living for children can, this is important, living for children can and usually does sustain the emotional satisfaction that partners need, especially if the long view is taken and spouses with community support are willing to give up short-term pleasures for a path to long-range winning in the field of battle. The primacy of institutional commitments over emotional satisfaction is all the more vivid if we look at the sorts of things that have been counted historically as elements of the life well lived. As this heroic virtue I talked about, we see two things in general when we think about heroism. We think about deeds of self-sacrifice, right? And we think of deeds of noble purpose. And typically, the latter, noble purpose, typically requires the former, self-sacrifice, right? Very, very rarely does anybody get something really noble done without some degree of self-sacrifice. So the Lord says, greater love has no man than this, than to lay down his life for his friends. The Lord accomplished both in his own heroism. Indeed, Jesus Christ is the model for all heroism and manly virtue. But also Odysseus, to whom I referred earlier, and the apostles of the church, and the saints and the pilgrims and the martyrs, and all the holy men and women. But we see something else in every heroic act, the willingness to accept the burdens, not of our own choosing, attached to the heroic act. So many heroes, before contemplating their heroism, they are afraid because things look tough, right? So this willingness to accept the burdens, not of their own choosing, that's where the heroism emerges. There is no courage, after all, if there's nothing to fear, right? So think about that when we think about marriage. There's no courage if there's nothing to fear. So the intention to be a hero or the intention to be the greatest lover of all history, or the intention to be the greatest mother of all time. The intention alone is just not enough. And this is a kind of startling truth when we think about it, but if we're honest, we know this in the fiber of our being. Which of us can manage even a small personal resolution like exercise or daily prayer if left to our own daily emotional inclinations? So in matters of very great importance, like how we spend our lives in relation to God and others, the institutions, these good institutions, I want to say, they provide for what we lack. So to achieve nobility, one must willingly accept the burdens, not of our own choosing, which are attached to noble acts. Committing oneself to another in an institutional setting, that is, right, what do we do when we do this? We make this commitment. We actually obey norms and rules we don't get to make up. We didn't make it up. Lifetime, monogamy, like you gotta support these kids, come what may. Because we are fallen and we are weak and we are selfish. I said there's no stability in me. We are not able, it turns out, this lack of stability, we are not able to carry out the noble intentions of our youth. The reality of childlessness that I just showed you in a society in which children fare very badly should be enough to convince us that we are not. We think that our children and that the love we have for our children will inspire, to borrow the title of another work in sociology, they will inspire promises that we can keep, and incentives to do the best we can. But this is pretty much a lie. It is for young people to say, I choose to love, I choose to give. But it is for wisdom to say, well done, it's a good choice. But commit yourself to love within an institution that can succeed at helping you, where you can succeed at fulfilling this intention, because you can't do it on your own. You got to do this roped in. So our contemporaries believe that institutions in general, so we said marriage is losing stock. Institutions are losing stock, right? Because we haven't understood institutions. They believe that institutions restrict and constrain us, right? They constrain our freedom. But in reality, good institutions, and there are bad ones, but good ones, exist to help us achieve the precious common goods that we think about, and in so achieving, they help us to live lives, ordinary lives of heroism. This is why institutions have those rules and those norms, and why they hold us to them. It is also why institutions bind us to one another, and this is also interesting. There are no institutions made up of solitary persons, right? And the reason is that heroism requires fellow soldiers. You just can't be a hero all by yourself. And this is not for lack of wanting, think about this, and it's not for lack of trying, but it's for lack of someone to serve, but also, more importantly, someone to save. Right? What do heroes do? They save people. They save people. So saving persons is the whole point of living well. We are not called to give ourselves away so that we can find ourselves. We're called to give ourselves away so that we can save others from the existential loneliness that leads to death. And this, if you were listening for it, you probably weren't. If you listened through Ryan Anderson's arc of life, a thing that he was kind of pointing out was in peril in the second arc of life was the extent to which we live lives that are lonely. So that kind of individualism is lonely. It's loneliness. But that's loneliness that leads to death. So in so doing and so saving each other to understand the meaning of our own existence, there is no loving truly without saving. And there is no easy way to save anyone. There's no easy way. So institutions make this possible. Now, I chose the word possible on purpose. I didn't say institutions make it easier. They make it possible. On our own, untethered to the great institutions of the Western tradition, especially marriage and the church, our efforts to love and save each other amount to sort of foolishness and pride. Imagine what we would say if one of you wanted to defend the country from foreign invaders, but refused to join the armed forces. It's like ridiculous. And imagine similarly if you said to me, I want to ascend Mount Carmel, but I refuse to join a monastery. I'm just going to kind of go do it myself. And imagine finally if you wish to succeed at loving one other person for that person's sake and for God's, without making any kind of binding commitment. Each of these is just a failed enterprise before it begins, but not only failed foolish, because we could have known at the outset we did not have the resources to accomplish the task. Everyone who hears these words of mine, the Lord says, and does not put them into practice is like a foolish man who builds his house on sand. So it is that these great institutions, the institutions themselves, if we're in them, they're like the battlefield of the Christian hero. If you're not in the institution, you don't get to fight. So in this battlefield, this is where small acts of faithfulness to the norms, carried out with intention year after year, transform us. And we succeed in this way at heroism when we really had no right to succeed, right? We can be like St. Peter, who said, "I will never deny you, Lord," but who on account of the church finally became the hero that he imagined himself to be, right? But he wasn't on his own. So perhaps we don't think about the church this way. We don't think about the church as an institution, actually. We don't do this, just in the same way that we don't think about marriage this way. I know my students don't. It's true that the essence of our faith is not a set of rules and norms. But being loyal disciples is difficult on our own. And if you need convincing, do look at the apostles. In fact, we need to be told how to do it. We have to be told how to be faithful. And we need our friends to hold us accountable. Think about this. Sometimes we worship because we feel like it, and sometimes we do so only because the church insists on it. The mistake is to believe that our participation and our fervor, what I bring to the church, makes the institution. That's a mistake. In truth, the institution itself supplies for my lack of fervor. And it schools us, it teaches us over time in the essence of true religious sentiment. So more simply put, the church doesn't stay alive because we feel devoted. Rather, we stay alive and we learn true devotion if we're obedient sons and daughters of the church. And if we think of the church more broadly and her various riches, schools and associations, religious life, as the institutional framework in which to live this commitment to God, then the framework itself, the institution, the norms and the rules, it starts to look more like a gift to us. Gee, I wanted to love God, but I really had no idea how. So actually, this is lucky for me. There's a church. Right? Lucky for me, I have some rules. I know how to do this. But we don't think about rules this way, right? So now marriage, which is really my subject, is the other great institution in which one can live for another, and usually, hopefully, for a few more others, with the support of the community and according to rules and norms we don't get to make up for ourselves. It is difficult to get up in the middle of the night with a baby. Someone in my hotel last night had a baby that was getting up in the middle of the night. It wasn't me, but it was the room next to me. But in the doing of these things, right, we do it. There's no one else is going to get up with that baby. We become, perhaps, the sort of person who might eventually do something good and selfless just because it is good and not because someone is crying. That sort of field can make heroes of the weakest of us. Any mother or father can do it if we don't run away and if we make binding commitments and follow through on them. If we're willing to take the long view, we may end up a little bit bloodied, but here we can succeed at fulfilling the yes of our youth. Note, too, before I finish, that marriage for heroism could not possibly be understood as a kind of capstone event of your single life, right? On the contrary, it would be instead a blessing to marry young because one can get started with the business of living for others as soon as possible. So a careful survey of culture, I want to say, which includes the things we've seen, the massive breakdown of family life, failures in the economy, political scandals, and more, points us to something fundamentally amiss in the institutions that are most closely ordered to the common good and to man's final end, such as the church. We are just getting something exactly backwards. While selfishness has never been in short supply, we have not ever, I think, until now or the last few decades, seen the institution of marriage socially and politically redefined as an instrument of personal satisfaction and self-regard. The story of our time, I think, in fact, is the story of an institutional revolution in self-love over self-gift. But institutions, this is the backwards part, institutions are supposed to be instruments of self-gift. Right? They're supposed, in the end, to help us live well and to help us achieve those noble aspirations of the human heart. So the task before us today, I think, and for the future, is to help to think about how to restore a path to national greatness through a rediscovery of the extraordinary, or perhaps the ordinary, heroism of marriage. Not a small task, I want to say, in a nation of deserters and cowards. For no glory awaits a nation that will just not engage in the battle. But eye has not seen and ear has not heard what glory awaits those who do follow him. Thank you.